This year we've been celebrating the 20th anniversary of this church building, and you may not know it, but we only owe about $69,000 on this church, which is a pretty small amount when you consider the size of the building. So we are very close to a mortgage burning party. And I invite everybody who, if you haven't had a chance to fill out your pledge cards, to do so that we can speed up the day of that mortgage burning party. I mention that because today we're talking about sacred space, and often when we talk about sacred space in the Western culture, we think about a building. Now, by tradition, a church building is called a house of God. But when Western European missionaries came to this country and started building these white clapboard churches, the Native Americans became very puzzled. They wondered how you could possibly fit God in such a small house. Now, in many people's minds, sacred space is associated with buildings, synagogues, mosques, churches, bricks and mortar buildings. Although sometime later this week, someone may be listening to this sermon online, so cyberspace may also be sacred space in our time. And there are many ways to think about sacred space. In the worldview of indigenous people all over the world, the earth is sacred. Every mountain and hillside is sacred. Every valley and every plain, every grove and every forest, every river and every lake. So this morning I want to talk about sacred space in the broadest possible terms. If the natives thought white people were trying to put God in a box, this morning I want us to think outside that box. Now, in my office, I have a coffee table book called 100 Sacred Places all over the world. And it reminds me that when many people think of sacred space, they think of exotic locations far away, like Stonehenge or Mecca or the river Ganges. The idea of sacred space is often associated with pilgrimages and taking a journey to a far-off place. So I want to begin by talking about that idea of pilgrimage before I move to the sacred spaces that are closer to home. On my sabbatical, I did a lot of traveling, and one part of that journey I have called the Great American Road Trip in France. I have a friend who retired to France who has a car camper, and so we traveled to some of the off-the-beaten-track places and spent the night in parking lots and in camping places and just went to these unusual sites. And during one stretch of that journey, we were in a region known as the Dordogne. Now, if you've heard of the Dordogne, it may be because some of the oldest works of art that have ever been made are housed in that region. Under the earth, there are prehistoric paintings made by Paleolithic artists that date back to 18,000 BCE to 10,000 BCE. There are paintings of animals like mammoths and ibexes and bulls and horses and oxes and deer. In one part of the cave in Lascaux, there's a room with over 600 paintings of different animals. Now, many of us know the story of Michelangelo painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel on his back on scaffolding. And these caves would have taken a similar amount of ingenuity and effort. The paintings are not random doodlings. They are the work of a community of artists who are working together to create a piece of art that works together as one piece of sacred art. The cave paintings remind us that early human beings did not practice an anthropocentric spirituality. Man was not the measure of all things. If you go into a cathedral or church, you often see statues and images of human beings like Jesus or Mary or the saints. In these caves, the focus is on all creatures of the earth and sky, the diversity of creation, the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. It's a celebration of life manifested in different animal forms and bodies and shapes. A French guide reminds visitors that these caves were not condos. People did not live inside of these caves. He says this is a sacred place. Just as you would not live inside a church, people did not live inside these caves. These caves were sanctuaries, holy places. Archaeologists believe the caves were a site for ceremonies, ritual gatherings, and rites of passage. The journey into a dark, womb-like cavern, and then the reemergence through a narrow passage back into the light would create a sense of rebirth and renewal. And maybe this similar kind of ritual played a part when Christians met and worshiped in the catacombs, going into the darkness, reemerging into the light, giving new meaning to that scripture that says, "Ye shall be born again." On some level, it makes sense that some of the oldest paintings known to the world would be in France. I like to think of these Paleolithic artists as sort of the gateway that leads to Monet and Renoir and Pissarro and all those great Impressionists. Or maybe it's more accurate to describe them as a prelude to the great artists and architects that created the cathedrals, Notre Dame and Chartres. Now, I mention these cathedrals for a very specific reason, because sometimes the distance between a cave and a cathedral can just be a few steps. For instance, there is a Benedictine abbey in Brantôme in the Dordogne where a church is actually carved into the face of a cliff, and it is sort of interconnected with a system of caves that were once ancient dwelling places. So the line between caves and cathedrals, prehistory and history, is very thin, almost non-existent. And in the caves there is a spring that gushes forth water, as is common in many sacred sites. Cool flowing water, pure and clear, a reminder of the wellspring of the joy of living, the fount of every blessing, the source of life from whom all blessings flow. Now, if you know much about the history of Western Europe, that you know that churches were often built on the sites that were sacred long before the churches were there. And so a church building might be on a location that was once a temple to a goddess. So when we visit the abbey, if you ever go to that abbey in the Dordogne, the thing is, when you move through that church to get to the caves, you do so with the knowledge that those caves were sacred and holy long before that church ever existed. Now, you may be wondering, what does all this talk of caves and catacombs and cathedrals have to do with our spiritual life today? What does a cave painted in 18,000 BCE have to do with what you and I do here in this room this morning in the 21st century? So let's move beyond reflecting on sacred spaces that are far away and move our reflections to closer to home. And perhaps Joseph Campbell, who was a scholar of comparative mythology, can help us understand the importance of sacred space to us here and now in this place. He wrote, "Sacred space is absolutely necessary for anybody today. You must have a room or a certain hour in the day or so where you don't know what was in the newspapers that morning, you don't know who your friends are, you don't know what you owe anybody, you don't know what anybody owes you. This is a place where you can simply experience and bring forth what you are and what you might be. This is the place of creative incubation. At first, you may find that nothing happens there. But if you have a sacred place and use it, something eventually will happen. Our lives have become so economic and practical in their orientation that as we get older, the claims of the moment often are so great, we hardly know where the hell we are or what it is we intended. We are always doing something that is required of us. Our sacred space is where we can find our soul again. Our sacred place is where we can find our soul again. Joseph Campbell was famous for advising people to follow your bliss. And while his spirituality was more affected by the Hindu tradition and Eastern spirituality, what he had to say is very similar to what the Christian theologian Frederick Buechner once said. He said, "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meets." And so you might say that a sacred space is where we are able to reconnect with our bliss, reconnect with our deep gladness, and discover our purpose and meaning in life to serve the world. A 300-year-old anonymous poem written sometime during the Ming Dynasty in China captures this sentiment about the sacred. "On the low wall of my garden, there stands a tiny shrine, half hidden in the shadow of the trees. When I am weary of this sad world and of human toil and strife, I steal off to my shrine among the trees. There, with silent prayer and incense, I find my soul again and thank heaven for my shrine among the trees." This ancient poem reminds us of our need to find sacred space here and now, to have a place where we can find our souls again. When I need to find my soul, I often go hiking in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park or the Cumberland Plateau or somewhere in the Cherokee Forest, or sometimes closer to home, Sharps Ridge, House Mountain, or along the boardwalk on the Tennessee River at IAM's Nature Center. This Tuesday is the spring equinox, and this will be the first year that the spring equinox has fallen when we have our outdoor labyrinth, which was built by the kids of this church as part of their summer camp. It's outside in the front, and so this spring equinox is the first time we have the opportunity to walk that labyrinth on the spring equinox, and you're invited to do so any time of the day on the spring equinox you would like to do so. Our church has both outdoor and indoor sacred space. However, even though I often seek sacred space outdoors, I would be very remiss if I did not include this sanctuary as one of the most sacred places in my life. This room is sacred to me. It's a place where we've dedicated our children and babies, and where we've celebrated weddings, and where we've mourned together in funerals. We've had lock-ins where teenagers have put on raucous coffee houses, and we have provided sanctuary to a busload of undocumented workers who turn these chairs into beds. We have heard parables and stories and sermons, and we've been swept away by music. We found within these walls the calm soul of all things that we often feel most profoundly in silence. And for many reasons, I am grateful for this sacred space. I'm especially grateful for this room as sacred space when it's raining outside, or when it's snowing, or when there's an ice storm. As much as I love hiking, I am grateful I've never had to conduct a memorial service in an ice storm. And when the roof leaks, I'm grateful that we have a maintenance budget for this sacred space. This room is sacred space. We have felt many different emotions in this room. We have been hurt together here. We have been healed together here. This week we have been watching students all over the country walk out of classrooms calling for action to address gun violence, and that has been a powerful experience. I love the aerial photos of the students that have written words with their own bodies, words like enough or a giant peace sign, making their football fields holy ground. Almost 10 years ago, there was an act of gun violence in this room where 2 people were killed and 8 others injured, a hate crime targeting us because we are a progressive church. After that hate crime, we decided to rededicate the sanctuary on the very next Sunday to have a service of rededication. At that rededication service, I said, "This sanctuary has been defiled by an act of violence, and we rededicate it to peace. This holy place, which has been desecrated by an act of hatred, we reconsecrate for love. This sacred space, which has seen death, we recommit to life. This holy spiritual home, which has known fear, we rededicate to faith." In the last 10 years, we have lived out the meaning of these words through worship and social action and community building. However, like the Native Americans, we can agree that you can't fit the infinite in this small of a box. It just can't be done. And so in closing, maybe someone who can understand sacred space maybe better than many of us would be the late Stephen Hawking, who died this week. He was a physicist who once described physics as a religion for atheists. When Hawking was a young man, he was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease that led to the complete paralysis of his body and life in a wheelchair. He was only able to speak by using a speech synthesizer that was part of a computer-based communication system. However, through the study of physics, he was able to contemplate something much larger than himself. And so whenever he was depressed, or wherever he met someone who was depressed or discouraged or down in the dumps, he would say, "Look up at the stars and not at your feet." So maybe we'll let him have the last word about sacred space. I invite you to join together in our closing hymn. Can someone shout out the number I got here without my order of service? 203, hymn 203.